In the opulent halls of Versailles, where chandeliers glittered and silk gowns rustled, Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the Revolution, lived a life of extravagance that captivated and scandalized her contemporaries. Born in 1755 as Maria Antonia, an Austrian archduchess, she arrived in France at 14, a delicate figure thrust into a world of rigid etiquette and unrelenting scrutiny. Her hygiene practices, shaped by the customs of her time and the peculiarities of her royal environment, have become the stuff of legends, some grounded in truth, others spun into grotesque caricature by her enemies. To understand her habits is to peel back the layers of myth and reality, revealing a woman caught between personal inclination and the constraints of her era. The 18th century was not an age of cleanliness as we know it. Bathing was not the daily ritual it is today, even among the elite. Water was often mistrusted, believed to carry disease or weaken the body by opening pores to harmful miasmas. In Vienna, where Marie Antoinette spent her childhood, the Habsburg court valued modesty and restraint, and bathing was a sporadic affair, often tied to medicinal or ceremonial purposes. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, instilled in her a sense of duty but little emphasis on personal cleanliness, beyond what was necessary for appearances. When Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles in 1772, marrying the future Louis XVI, she brought with her these Austrian habits, which clashed with the French court's own peculiarities. At Versailles, the queen's bathing habits were strikingly infrequent by modern standards. She bathed approximately once a month, a schedule dictated by both tradition and practicality. The process was laborious. Servants hauled water to her private apartments, heating it over fires and pouring it into a copper or wooden tub draped with linens to prevent splinters or cold metal against her skin. These baths were not for hygiene alone, but for relaxation and ritual, often infused with herbs like thyme or lavender, believed to have therapeutic properties. The queen's preference for such herbs stemmed from her Austrian upbringing, where herbal baths were a nod to health rather than cleanliness. Yet the infrequency of these baths meant that body odor was a persistent issue, one she addressed not with water, but with other means, as was common among her peers. The French court's approach to hygiene leaned heavily on superficial remedies. Clothing was changed frequently, sometimes multiple times a day, to maintain an illusion of freshness. But the body beneath often went unwashed. Marie Antoinette's wardrobe was legendary, with hundreds of gowns tailored to her whims. Yet these garments, heavy with embroidery and layered with petticoats, trapped sweat and grime against her skin. Her undergarments, made of fine linen or silk, were laundered more regularly. But the outer layers, encrusted with jewels and lace, were rarely cleaned due to their delicate construction. This reliance on fresh fabrics rather than bodily cleansing was standard. But for a queen under constant observation, it invited whispers. Courtiers noted her reluctance to bathe more often, attributing it to laziness or foreign eccentricity, though it aligned with the era's norms. Her youth and beauty, celebrated in portraits by artists like Elizabeth Lebrun, masked the reality of these practices. The queen's skin, described as luminous, was maintained not through washing but through elaborate cosmetic rituals that supplemented her sparse bathing. She used rose water and almond oil to refresh her face and hands, applying them with soft cloths in private moments. These practices, while luxurious, were insufficient to combat the accumulation of sweat and dirt in an era without modern sanitation. The court's physicians occasionally recommended baths for health reasons, particularly during her pregnancies, but these were exceptions rather than the rule. Her adherence to monthly bathing, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was unremarkable in a world where water was a luxury and cleanliness a secondary concern. The queen's environment at Versailles did little to encourage better habits. The palace, though magnificent, was a labyrinth of filth. Its corridors were often littered with refuse, and chamber pots were emptied haphazardly, sometimes out of windows into courtyards below. The lack of proper plumbing meant that even the royal apartments were not immune to odors. Marie Antoinette's private chambers, though more secluded than most, were still serviced by an army of servants who tracked in dirt and waste. The water supply, drawn from nearby rivers or wells, was often contaminated, reinforcing the belief that bathing was risky. Her occasional baths, therefore, were as much a statement of privileged access to heated, scented water as they were a hygienic act. As she settled into her role as queen, Marie Antoinette developed a fascination with perfumes, a passion that became a hallmark of her public persona. Scents were her armor, a way to project elegance while masking the realities of infrequent bathing. Perfume was not merely a luxury, but a necessity, in a court where body odor was ubiquitous. She favored complex fragrances crafted by Jean-Louis Fargin, her personal perfumer, who blended essences like rose, jasmine, and tuberose with musky undertones. These were applied liberally to her skin, hair, and clothing, creating an aura of floral sophistication. Her gowns were often stored with sachets of dried herbs and flowers, ensuring that every movement released a cloud of fragrance. This obsession with scent was not unique to her. Louis XIV himself had been a devotee of perfumes, but her reliance on them fueled gossip that she used them to conceal a lack of cleanliness. Fargin's creations were tailored to her tastes, often incorporating exotic ingredients like ambergris or civet, which added depth to her perfumes, but carried their own pungent notes. She also used scented gloves, a fashion borrowed from Italian courts, where leather was soaked in fragrant oils to mask the smell of tanning. These gloves, embroidered with gold thread, were both a status symbol and a practical tool for hygiene in an age when hands were rarely washed. Her bath water, when she did bathe, was infused with sachets of herbs and flower petals, a practice she learned from her mother. These sachets, known as bain d'eau, were believed to invigorate the body, though their primary effect was to leave a lingering scent on her skin. The queen's love of fragrance extended to her surroundings. Her apartments were filled with potpourri, and her furniture was polished with scented waxes. This reliance on perfume was not without its drawbacks. The heavy use of scents could be overwhelming, and courtiers occasionally complained of headaches in her presence. Yet, to Marie Antoinette, perfume was an extension of her identity, a way to assert control over her image in a court that judged her every move. Her fragrance rituals were meticulously planned, with Fargin visiting her regularly to present new blends or adjust existing ones. These sessions were a rare moment of intimacy in her otherwise public life, allowing her to indulge in sensory pleasure away from prying eyes. But the reliance on scent over substance only deepened the perception that her hygiene was lacking, perception that her enemies would later exploit. The act of bathing itself, when it occurred, was far from private. Versailles operated under a system of etiquette that turned even the most personal acts into public spectacles. The queen's morning routine, known as the lever, was a ritual attended by dozens of courtiers. From ladies-in-waiting to high-ranking nobles, bathing, though less frequent, followed a similar pattern. When Marie Antoinette bathed, the event was staged in her private apartments, but private was a misnomer. Servants prepared the tub, maids adjusted her linens, and ladies-in-waiting stood by to assist, all while gossiping or vying for her favor. The queen, naked or clad in a thin chemise, was on display, her every gesture observed and critiqued. This lack of privacy was not unique to her. Louis XV's mistresses had bathed under similar scrutiny, but it added a layer of discomfort to an already cumbersome process. The public nature of her baths was rooted in the court's obsession with access to the monarch. To be present at such moments was a privilege, a sign of favor, but it left little room for modesty. Marie Antoinette, accustomed to the more reserved Habsburg court, initially resisted this intrusion, requesting fewer attendants. Her protests were met with resistance. Etiquette was sacrosanct, and reducing the number of onlookers was seen as a breach of tradition. Over time, she acquiesced, but her discomfort was evident. She would often hurry through the process, wrapping herself in linens to shield her body from prying eyes. The bath itself was a performance, with scented water and ornate tubs serving as props in the theater of royalty. This spectacle extended to her preparation for the bath. Servants would parade through the palace carrying jugs of heated water, their progress noted by courtiers eager for gossip. The queen's choice of herbs or oils was a topic of discussion, as was the frequency of her baths or a lack thereof. Some accounts suggest she bathed more often in summer, when the heat of Versailles made odors more pronounced. But even then, the process remained a communal affair. Her ladies-in-waiting, tasked with scrubbing her back or rinsing her hair, were often more concerned with securing her favor than ensuring her cleanliness. The result was a ritual that prioritized appearance over efficacy, leaving her only marginally cleaner than before. The environment of Versailles compounded these challenges. The palace, home to thousands of courtiers, servants, and visitors, was a cesspool of filth. Its grandeur hid a grim reality. Waste was disposed of in corners, stairwells, or courtyards, and the lack of indoor plumbing meant that chamber pots were a primary means of sanitation. These were emptied irregularly, often by overworked servants who spilled their contents in haste. The Seine River, which supplied much of the palace's water, was polluted with refuse, making even the cleanest bathwater suspect. Marie Antoinette's apartments, while better maintained than most, were not immune to these conditions. Rats and insects were common, and the air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and decaying food. The Queen's efforts to improve her surroundings were limited. She commissioned renovations to her private apartments, including the Petit Trianon, a smaller retreat where she could escape the main palace's chaos. Yet even there, hygiene remained a challenge. The Trianon had no running water, and baths still required servants to haul and heat water manually. The Queen's love of nature, expressed through her gardens and artificial village at the Hameau de la Reine, did not extend to a modern understanding of sanitation. Her rustic retreat was charming, but no cleaner than Versailles. With open streams used for washing linens and livestock adding to the mess, her attempts to create a private sanctuary were thwarted by the same logistical constraints that plagued the main palace. The court's water supply was a particular problem. Wells and cisterns were often contaminated, and the cost of transporting clean water from distant sources was prohibitive. The Queen's baths, when they occurred, used water that was boiled and filtered, but this was a luxury not extended to the wider palace. Servants, who handled everything from food to laundry, rarely washed their hands, spreading grime and disease. The Queen herself was not immune. She suffered from skin irritations and minor infections, likely exacerbated by the unsanitary conditions. Her physicians prescribed herbal baths or bloodletting for these ailments, treatments that were as likely to harm as to help. The lack of understanding about germs meant that even the most well-intentioned efforts at cleanliness were undermined by the palace's environment. Marie Antoinette's appearance, so central to her role as queen, relied heavily on cosmetics and elaborate hairstyles, which introduced their own hygiene issues. Her face was coated with cerose, a lead-based white paint that gave her skin its porcelain glow, but was toxic over time. This was applied daily, layered over unwashed skin, clogging pores and causing blemishes that required even more makeup to conceal. Her cheeks were rouged with carmine, and her lips painted with beeswax-based pomades, all of which added to the buildup on her face. Removing these cosmetics was a challenge. Without modern cleansers, she relied on oils or vinegar-soaked cloths, which often left residue behind. The process was time-consuming and imperfect, contributing to the perception that her hygiene was lacking. Her hair, styled into towering poufs by her hairdresser, was another source of controversy. These wigs, often made from human or horsehair, were shaped with animal fat and dusted with flour to achieve their volume. The fat attracted vermin, and the flour could harbor lice, making her elaborate hairstyles a breeding ground for pests. Washing her natural hair was rare. Instead, it was combed and powdered, with the powder itself made from starch or ground bone adding to the grime. The wigs were not cleaned regularly, as dismantling them was a costly and time-consuming process. Instead, they were aired out or perfumed, perpetuating the cycle of filth. Courtiers whispered of lice infestations, though these stories were likely exaggerated by those eager to tarnish her reputation. The Queen's health suffered from these practices. The lead in her makeup caused skin lesions, and possibly neurological issues, while the weight of her wigs led to headaches and neck strain. Her dental health, a common problem in the 18th century, was also poor. Sugar-heavy diets and lack of oral hygiene left her with blackened teeth, which she hid behind closed-lipped smiles. Her attempts to maintain her beauty, while admired by some, were seen by others as evidence of vanity and neglect. The contrast between her polished exterior and the reality of her hygiene practices fed into the growing discontent among her subjects, who viewed her extravagance as a symbol of royal decadence. As the French Revolution loomed, Marie Antoinette's hygiene became a weapon in the hands of her enemies. Revolutionary propagandists seized on her foreign origins and lavish lifestyle to paint her as a decadent, unclean figure. Lurid with lurid tales of her bathing in wine or milk, a gross exaggeration of her herbal baths. Others claimed she never bathed at all, wallowing in filth while the French people starved. These stories were part of a broader campaign to dehumanize her, transforming the queen into a caricature of excess. The reality was more nuanced. Her hygiene practices, limited by modern standards, were typical of her class and time, shaped by the constraints of Versailles and the expectations of her role. The myths about her hygiene were rooted in a kernel of truth but amplified for political effect. Her infrequent bathing, reliance on perfumes, and public rituals were real but not unique to her. The revolutionaries, however, framed these as evidence of moral decay, contrasting her supposed filth with the purity of the revolutionary cause. Her Austrian background made her an easy target. As L'Autrichienne, she was portrayed as a foreigner who brought alien, unclean habits to France. These attacks ignored the broader context of 18th-century hygiene, where even the most fastidious nobles rarely bathed more than she did. The propaganda was effective, cementing her image as a decadent queen whose personal habits mirrored the corruption of the monarchy. In her final years, as the revolution swept away the old regime, Marie Antoinette's hygiene practices became irrelevant. Imprisoned in the Temple, and later the Conciergerie, she had no access to the luxuries of Versailles. Her baths, once a rare indulgence, were replaced by simple wash basins, and her perfumes and cosmetics were gone. Yet even in confinement, she maintained a dignity that contrasted with the propaganda that had vilified her. Her trial and execution in 1793 marked the end of her story. But the myths about her hygiene endured, shaping her legacy as a symbol of excess and neglect. Reflecting on Marie Antoinette's hygiene practices reveals less about her personal failings and more about the world she inhabited. The 18th century was a time of transition, where old beliefs about health and cleanliness were beginning to shift, but had not yet embraced modern sanitation. Her habits, infrequent bathing, heavy perfumes, public rituals, and reliance on toxic cosmetics were products of her environment, not aberrations. Versailles itself, with its squalor hidden beneath splendor, was a microcosm of these contradictions. The propaganda that targeted her hygiene was a tool to dismantle her image, but it also obscured the reality of a woman navigating a complex and unforgiving role. Her story, stripped of myth, is one of adaptation and constraint, where even the act of bathing was a negotiation between tradition, necessity, and spectacle.